So, this story is about the weirdest night shift I ever had. Maybe not the creepiest, as I have certainly dealt with my share of creeps and people that were blazed out of their mind. Not looking down on people that deal with addiction, just saying they can do some terrifying things. I've obviously had my fair share of weird people stumble through the door on my overnight shift at the station where I work. But this night takes the cake. It was one of those shifts that kind of started off crappy. I was the only one working because the other overnight attendant was out sick with COVID. But of course, instead of the boss scheduling someone else, he just told me to suck it up and that things would be fine with just one person. He's kind of a cheapskate, obviously. Anyways, it's around 2 a.m. when this random guy walks into the station. Average height, a bit hefty, but mostly nondescript. He's got longer, greasy hair, but that doesn't mean much. Most of the customers on the overnight come in looking like they don't really believe in self-care. One thing I noted about him, though, was that he had an intense look on his face. Like he was there with purpose. Now, I have been robbed before, and the guy had that same look. But he immediately walked to the counter and told me to give him the cash. This guy had the look, but turned and asked me if we carried RC Cola. I told him that we did, 2 liters and single-serve bottles, and mentioned that it was right by the Dr. Pepper in the second door from the left. Yes, I have the store's layout memorized. He heads over, grabs 3 bottles of RC, and a bag of the TGI Fridays potato skin chips, and drops them on the counter. I ring him up and tell him his total. He pulls a few bills from his pocket. He then starts fumbling around for a moment, and then mumbles an apology. That's when I notice he's about $2 and some change short on the purchase. I figure, based on this guy's intense frustration over not having the cash, that he'd had one hell of a night already. So I tell him, "Hey man, I got $2 on me. Don't sweat it. I'll cover the rest. You just have a good rest of the night, alright?" He starts to ask me if I'm sure, saying that he could just put something back, but I wave him off, saying it's cool and to just pay it forward in the future if he can. He then gives me the biggest grin I've seen someone give. Like, I literally just changed his life, and then he reaches into his pocket. Now, at first, I'm thinking this was a test, and this guy was going to give me $100 for being kind. A guy can dream, right? But then he slides a handgun out of the inner pocket of his jacket. Yeah, a gun. And I immediately think that I'm about to get robbed again. But the way he took the gun out didn't make sense for that to be his plan. He didn't do so threateningly. He pulled it out almost carefully, respectfully even. He then gently placed it on the counter and slid it over to me. "Here," he said with his voice low and quiet. "Take this as my way of saying thanks. It'll save your life." Then, he gives me that same smile, a slight nod, and just walks out with his RC and potato chips. So, there I am, alone in a gas station at 2-something in the morning, with a dirty handgun sitting on my counter. I'm thinking that this has to be a joke. There's no way that some dude just left a gun there as a payment for me covering $2. My second thought is that something worse is going to happen, and I'm about to die like it's some kind of messed up horror movie. But nothing happens. The guy is just gone. The gun is sitting there, and for several moments I'm just staring at it in silence. I grabbed some plastic gloves from under the counter. There was no way I was touching that thing barehanded, and put the gun in a plastic bag and then placed that on the floor behind me, and called the cops. The officers arrive, and they ask about a call they got saying that someone had found a gun in the store. I had to correct them, and explain that I didn't find the gun, that I was given the gun. And they both looked at me like I was crazy or telling an awful joke. I explain what happened, and they both have this same look of, "This guy's high," on their face. But I assure them the whole thing played out just like I said. I even showed them the security footage of the guy putting it down and sliding it toward me. They take the gun, thank me, and tell me they'll be in touch if they have any further questions, and then tell me to call them if I see the guy again. The rest of the shift, I was nervous, thinking that this guy may come back for his weapon, realizing he gave it away to a stranger, but it was a relatively quiet night after that. I seriously felt crazy. Like, who gives a gun to a gas station attendant as a thank you for buying their damn potato chips for them? Here's where things got truly bizarre, though. About a week or so later, one of the officers come back while he's off duty to get some coffee. But he recognizes me, and he decides to fill me in on a bit of information. Turns out, the gun was hot. It had been stolen, and potentially used in a homicide a little while back, about 3 blocks from my gas station. They were still trying to piece everything together, but this was a huge lead for them in that case, since they now had the weapon and the guy's fingerprints on it, as well as the footage from the store. So, in the end, him, I guess, gifting me this gun was a good thing, because it helped to potentially solve a robbery/homicide from a while back. Of course, I have no idea why he thought I should have the gun, as if I wasn't going to call the police and give it to them. But maybe he really thought I wouldn't? No clue. I worked that overnight shift for about 6 months after that, but I hit a point where I wanted to change things up. So I moved to days at the same station. Thankfully, nothing more like that has ever happened since. Neither to me, nor the poor souls that work the overnights there now. There have been other weird and creepy things for sure, but nothing quite like that. I made this account to post here. Anyways, this happened around like 2021, and sometimes I still find it hard to grasp. For context, I now live in a different place, and along with most of my relatives, so I feel safer saying this on here. The reason I'm posting this is for people to learn and possibly caution themselves from my experience. I'd say the place that I lived in was just pretty old. It wasn't densely populated nor empty. It had wooded areas around it. You could cycle to the mall, school, and other normal places, but you would have to take a car to go to places like the hospital. I was basically in my last year of high school. Being an only child and a girl on top of that made my parents overprotective, and I was naturally more cautious than the rest of my friend group. I didn't really mind being that way, though, because I always thought that that was the better option. So, teenagers from school would have these outdoor get-togethers in the woods a few kilometers away from the school. It was just common for people to lounge out and about, chilling until 3 a.m. or something. Including me, it was a group of 4. And they decided since it was our last year that we should probably drink together in the woods. Obviously, looking back, stupid freaking idea. But it wasn't unsafe. And it wasn't deep in the woods either. There's a pretty clear trail and a small openish area where people would like to get their dogs and whatnot. We planned to do it on a Thursday because my parents would be out, and the rest would convince theirs that we were having a sleepover. Now, we bought the alcohol and some other stuff to just chill out. There were no others that day because it was a weekday, and quite chilly out as well. It was pretty lively. You could see the houses from the distance, and people would be driving around as well. So, naturally, we felt safer. We walked on the trails for about 1 minute when I felt uneasy. I felt like we were being watched or something like that. And I looked over to one of my friends. She looked a little distressed, but We just shrugged it off. We walked only a few minutes more and found our spot. We started drinking and basically spent like 1 hour and approximately 30 minutes of gossiping and having those deep talks while being drunk. I didn't drink too much, and neither did my other friends. We were just a little tipsy. Now, we forgot about the brief weird feeling we had felt while walking until we heard something from the thick trees in front of us. Even though we were loud, we all heard it. It was this weird snicker/giggle. I got up from this tree log that I was sitting on and dragged my friends back a little. We had a fire going and 2 torches, but still really couldn't see into that area. It wasn't that close to us. Think around 4 doors away if you placed them horizontally. So, the fact that we heard that laugh was just insane to me. I pointed the flashlight straight into the area and no one came out. I sat back down, and when I turned the flashlight off, there was a silhouette coming out. I switched the flashlight on to blind that person, while my other friends did the same. We started yelling and getting ready to run when I saw the most horrifying sight of my life. It was this man who we had never seen before. He had this plastered-on smile, and his hair was covered in dirt. He was pale, and his eyes were almost like he was not looking at us, but just in our general direction. I can't really explain it, but it was just textbook creepy. We all ran for it. My very drunk friends even managed to snap out of it. We got to my house. I lived the closest to the place, and said that we would call the cops. We were absolutely scared of our parents, but it didn't matter. We called the cops, and they found nothing. Word got out and people pretty much stayed away from the paths at nighttime, and a couple of the guys in our school managed to get their dads, and all with guns, to find the guy. But nothing ever came of it. Fast forward to like 1 month later, we didn't talk about it much and never did anything like that again. I got a pocket knife and a pepper spray to keep. I went home after school and was exhausted, so I decided to take a nap. My dad was at work and my mom was visiting her sister. I suddenly woke up to this weird sound. We only had 1 story and the walls were not too thick. I locked all the doors and even the windows out of habit. Still, fearing for the worst, I locked my room door and kind of looked out my window. There was nothing. I grabbed a bat and my phone, heading out of my room. I looked at all the doors and everything was locked. There was like this weird shuffling outside of my house, and I looked out through the window of my living room. I kid you not, it was the same dude from the woods. He was just outside walking in this erratic, eerie way, which sent me into a spiral. He somehow saw me and started saying, "Hi there," very loudly. I called the police, and after that, I told him to screw off. Then he started saying my name and all of my friends' names. The police came and questioned him. He has no history of mental illness. He had no clinical disorder, and after enough torture, he confessed to, quote, liking young women. He's in jail now. Probably will get out in a couple of years. Edit. By torture, I meant interrogation. My dad has a friend who's a cop, and the cop told him that the guy would scream when they asked him things. He was also guilty of attempted SA and harassment, but that's all that I know of. Hey Raven, you asked for hospital stories, and I just so happened to have a story about something terrifying that happened while I was a nurse a long time ago. I retired from that job several years ago, but this story has always stuck with me. Probably because it was the most I guess, exciting thing to happen while I worked there. I worked in the units where we had longer-term patients, ones that needed to be there for a few days to weeks, depending on what was really wrong with them. And among my charges was a man named Daniel. Daniel had a pretty bad case of pneumonia that had nearly taken him out. Like, completely taken him out, if you get me. He was a fighter, though, and he was on a good track in his recovery. He was a pretty quiet guy when he was finally able to start talking again, which I didn't blame him for. I don't think I would want to talk either if I'd almost died from pneumonia. On the third or so day of his stay, things took a pretty sharp turn into the unimaginable, and it wasn't even because of his infection. I was making my rounds, checking on my patients and making sure everyone was feeling better. I got to Daniel and was checking on a few things, mostly his oxygen levels, making sure he was getting his meds and so on. When the door got shoved open hard enough for it to hit the wall, and this woman burst into the room like a storm. She was breathless, like she had been running, and her eyes looked wild. I tried to come between her and Daniel, and I asked her if she was his wife. She replied with, "No, I'm his girlfriend. Or at least I was, until about an hour ago." Which was a weird way to phrase it, but I looked over at Daniel and I could see the fear on his face. I could tell that there was some major tension there, and I made an attempt to say something to her, but she cut me off and started yelling at Daniel. The whole time, his eyes wide and his heart rate spiking. She explained, very loudly, that she had gone to Daniel's house to surprise him, only to be met at the door by his wife. The confrontation that they had apparently unearthed a sordid affair, and both women were now aware of the other. I again tried to step in and calm her down, trying to tell her that this was a conversation best had when he wasn't fighting pneumonia in a hospital bed. But I was basically just background noise at that point. Her eyes were locked on him, and his eyes were looking around for an exit. She started screaming more about how he had lied to her, and how she loved him. And I, in turn, grabbed the phone to call security. I had this gut feeling that it was going to get worse, that his already strained body was going to shut down, and he would end up coding or something. And that's when she pulled out a knife from her bag. The world seemed to slow down as she lunged for Daniel. There was nothing I was able to do to stop her at this point, as I was several steps away, at the phone on the wall, and she was moving at the speed of a woman scorned. I started screaming for help, yelling that we needed someone in the room immediately, hoping that someone would notice all the commotion and figure out that something was wrong. And I watched as she plunged the knife straight into Daniel. Thankfully, though, he was cognizant enough to turn, so the knife only went straight into his arm. If he had been any weaker, there was a high chance that she would have stabbed him straight in the chest. The next few seconds were loud and confusing. Several other nurses ran into the room, and together we were able to subdue her until security arrived and cuffed her for the police. The relief of this argument not ending in tragedy was palpable, but so was the shock. In my years at the hospital, I had seen the toll illness could take on people, and their relationships. But I've never had anything play out like that right in front of my eyes. Thankfully, Daniel was already in the right place to be treated for the new hole in his arm. It was pretty bad, but nothing fatal, and nothing that wouldn't heal over time. Obviously, I think the mental scars were much worse for the guy. Yes, cheating is reprehensible, but so is stabbing someone in a hospital bed while they're a few days back from the verge of death. The police did show up and take the girlfriend away, and it was really awkward when his wife arrived later. Thankfully, she was a bit more level-headed, though I'd be lying if I didn't mention the fact that we all watched her like a hawk to make sure nothing more happened. She was pretty devastated that he could do that to her, but she didn't bring anything sharp into the room. We made sure of that. Daniel did get better physically, but I can only imagine how messed up he was mentally. Like I said, gross that he had an affair, but damn did I feel bad for him. Going from being unable to breathe to having a psychotic girlfriend run in the room and shove a knife in his arm in 3 days is quite the feat. I have no idea what happened in his marriage. I just hope that nothing else happens to him after he left our care. This was something that happened to me when I was 16. My family, which included myself, my 13-year-old sister, my baby brother, and mom and dad, took a trip during our spring break. We went to Florida as a lot of my father's family lived there, so we were going to be visiting them. However, we were going to be staying at a nearby hotel, so that way no one had to make room for our 5-person family. Being 16, I preferred this anyway because my parents got a room for my sister, Lily, and myself, and then a room for them. I've always been close to Lily, so we just felt like independent adults having the room to ourselves. We pretended we were there on a business trip, pretty much just playing pretend while in the room, and I know that she loved it too. I had also babysat multiple times, so it was normal for me to be alone and being responsible for Lily. This extended to us being at the hotel, where we were allowed to go to the pool whenever we wanted, as long as we told them when we went. The first time we went was great. We had fun, the rest of our family joined us shortly after, and everything was fine. The following day, we wanted to swim again, but also wanted to look mature and independent. So I did both of our makeup, and I reminded Lily that she couldn't go underwater with it. So we got to the pool and started at the shallow end, slowly making our way to the deeper side. We started swimming, racing from one end to the other, and in between breaks, I noticed a boy watching us from the other side of the pool. He was younger, and if I had to guess, he was probably close to my age. I looked over multiple times, trying to make it look like I was just scanning the pool area, but every time, he was looking at me smiling. Finally, I smiled back, not being able to avoid his eye contact. After we raced again, I pointed him out to my sister, and she agreed that he was definitely watching us. And she said that he was cute, and then dared me to go talk to him. I was in no way going to do that, though. I had a few crushes on people at my school, but never a relationship, and I didn't know anything on how to even strike up a conversation with this stranger. So after a little teasing, we just continued enjoying our time. But then something else caught my eye. I first looked over where the boy was, and there was now an older guy sitting on the entrance steps into the water, also staring at us. He was smiling and winked when he made eye contact, but this was not a happy feeling. It was awkward, and definitely creepy. So I broke eye contact with him quickly and started looking around for the younger boy. I spotted him again on the diving boards, obviously showing off. He started with normal dives, and then tried to do backflips, or anything else that he could think of. That was until the lifeguard told him to stop. He brushed it off as he walked away from it, and I just remember he looked really cool about it. If I would have been yelled at by a lifeguard, I probably would have scurried away embarrassed, but not him, which I guess only made him look cuter. After the diving, he went to the hot tub and we continued to swim until I heard my mom say my name. She came into the pool room to tell us that we needed to get out for dinner, so we started making our way to the exit. Lily got out before me and was already grabbing towels, as I lingered slowly behind. wondering if I should approach the boy or just continue on. But as I slowly got out of the pool, the older guy that I spotted earlier was still by the stairs, and he stopped me. I just looked at him and he nodded towards the boy in the hot tub and told me that his son thought I was cute. I remember my face turning red, and I looked over at the boy again, who then looked away from me. At the time, I had done that when we made eye contact, so now I was thinking he was shy or embarrassed that his dad actually told me. I just let out a nervous chuckle and said thanks, not really knowing what else to say. He laughed as well, and offered to give me his son's phone number. Again, not knowing how to react to this, I agreed. Looking back, I probably should have said no, but at that moment I didn't know what to do. Thankfully, I didn't have a cell phone at the time of this event, so I didn't have a number to give. And I certainly wasn't going to give out our landline number. He gave me a piece of paper that already had a phone number written on it. I took it, and as I folded it up, he leaned in close to my ear and said, "You know, you're welcome to come up to our room with us, if you want to have some fun." He stood back up and winked at me, and that horrible feeling came back. I almost felt sick and afraid of what he might do. I said I would have to ask my parents and then quickly ran over to Lily. She asked me what he said and what he gave me, but I just told her it wasn't important and threw the paper away as we left the pool. Once we got back to our room and changed, we met back up with our parents for dinner. As we drove, I told them about the boy that we saw, but then I also mentioned the older man that asked me to go to his room. My dad was driving, and I remember his eyes looking at me in the mirror, and my mom took off her sunglasses and turned around to look at me. At first, I thought maybe I did something wrong, but my dad asked if I kept the number, and I told him no. My mom then told me that I did the right thing by not going, and said that if I saw him again, either one of them, to tell them immediately. But that also meant that we weren't allowed free reign of the pool anymore, which was kind of a bummer, but I also understood why. The next day we went swimming again in the afternoon, but that time, my parents were there. They were in the shallow end with my baby brother. And while Lily and I continued playing on our own, we went without makeup, so we wanted to go down the water slide. While waiting in line, I kept scanning the area, conflicted on if I wanted him to show up or not. While I didn't see the older guy, I did spot the boy who was making his way to the slide. I don't know what came over me, but as he approached, he noticed me and smiled, but I immediately confronted him. I told him, "I'm sorry, but your dad was creepy yesterday." He looked at me confused, so I told him what he said about the phone number, all of it, and he just looked at me like I was crazy. The only thing he said after that was, "I'm here with my grandparents. I don't even know my dad." He then pointed to an older couple in the hot tub, and after we went down the slide, he even called out to them by name, and they looked over to him to watch him go down the slide. Once we were all back in the free swimming pool, he confirmed that he had no idea who that guy was, and that's why he looked away yesterday. He said he thought the guy was saying something to me about him, and he also thought that he was weird. I was overwhelmed hearing this. I'm glad that he wasn't related to that guy, but then I was sick knowing that this full man just invited me, a 16-year-old girl, back to his room. I may have been wearing makeup, but I still looked very young. There is no way that he mistook me for an adult. To add to it, he lied about the boy to try and convince me to go with him to his room. This all told me that he really didn't have any good intentions that day. I told my parents about all this, and they definitely seemed concerned, but again just said to keep an eye out for the old guy, and to let them know. I don't know what else they really could have done at that point either. Thankfully, we never did see him again. but the rest of the day at the pool was off. The boys swam with us, but for the most part, it was just like having a new friend for the time being. I didn't get his real number either. The following day we were leaving the hotels, so we didn't swim. Not that I really wanted to after all that had happened. I was afraid that guy was going to show up, and I didn't know what he would do if he did. I'm an adult now with a little girl, and it's definitely made me very protective of her and watching everything she does, because such an innocent situation at first could have turned out much, much worse. I need to add another trigger warning to this story again, as it contains the same subject matter as the other story, and this definitely could be sensitive to others. So, trigger warning on this one as well, and yeah. I just wanted to start this off by saying that I love your podcast. I listen to it every night before I go to sleep, and it keeps me entertained for hours when I'm just pottering around the house. So thank you. Thank you as well. I was 19 when this happened. I woke up one morning and saw that I had 3 missed calls from an unknown number. 2 were just after midnight, and the third was a little past 1 a.m. I sleep with my phone on Do Not Disturb, so none of these calls came through for me. I didn't think much of it, as my mom has some mental health issues and is always calling on unknown numbers. I forget about it and moved on with my day. It was the next day, and I was going out to a club with some girlfriends. It was a Sunday night, and there was a special guest at the club, so we all bought tickets and headed over. I'd had a few drinks, but I wasn't drunk, just a little tipsy. I was completely aware of everything around me, so I can promise that I did not misunderstand the situation or imagine any of this. It was around 1 a.m., and I was walking through the dance floor when I felt my phone vibrating. I was getting a phone call from an unknown number. By the time I saw the call pop up on my phone, I once again had already missed 2 calls from them just a few minutes earlier. I answered the phone, and whoever was on the other side hung up immediately. Of course, they called back within a few seconds of ending the other call. I finally answered. "Hello," I said. Keep in mind, I'm in a club, so I couldn't hear a thing. I said to whoever was on the phone, "Don't hang up. Let me go somewhere quiet so I can hear you." The man on the other line replied, "Okay, you go somewhere quiet." I went to the bathrooms, where it was a little quieter, and could finally hear what this man was trying to say to me. He said to me, "Aaron, this stays between us, okay?" "Okay," I replied back. I didn't recognize the voice at all. However, he referred to me by my first name, so he obviously knew who I was. The voice on the other end of the phone said to me, clear as day, "I'm going to rape you one day, Aaron." I didn't have any time to process what he had said before he hung up. I sank to the floor and started crying. I was in shock. Keep in mind, I'm 4'11" and not even 50 kilograms. I'm an easy target. I'm little. Obviously, being tipsy and at a club, I made the decision to leave. I called my ex that I had recently broken up with, and I asked if he could come pick me up. From there, we went directly to the police station. They asked me to come back the following day and give a statement when I was sober, so that's what I did. The police took my claim very seriously and could not have been more helpful. They took all my details down, and my phone specs, I'm assuming so that they could trace the call. I finished up with the statement and went home. I took a couple of days off work just to process what had happened, and also because I was terrified to leave my house, to go to work, and even walk to my car once my shifts were over. I worked in a shopping center/mall, so I had to walk to the underground car parks at 10 a.m. after work. A week went by, and I didn't receive any more calls from the unknown number. nothing at all. The police did get back to me, though, and this is the unnerving part. They told me that they had managed to trace the call back to a phone box. They couldn't tell me the specific area due to all the different call towers or something like that. I'm not too sure how it all works. However, it was a phone box. The ones that are on the side of the road that you need to put coins in. Yeah, one of those. When you put it into perspective, someone had gone out of their way at 1 a.m. on a Sunday night to go to this phone box, with enough money to call me multiple times. I also have no doubts that this was the same person behind the unknown calls from the previous night also, which also means this person went out of their way multiple nights in a row just to call me and threaten me. It's now been almost 5 years since this happened, and I have never found out who it was. My stomach still drops when I see a no-caller ID come up on my phone. I don't know who this person was. I don't know if he was being serious or just trying to scare me. I really don't want to find out, though. This isn't as scary as some of the other stories on here, but it is my own creepy encounter. Thank you for taking the time to listen. This happened about a decade ago, when I was 19. At the time, I rented an apartment in a West Side neighborhood of Chicago with my sister, who was a year older than me. We both worked hospitality jobs in the city, and we both had pretty robust social lives. So it was fairly typical for one or both of us to get home at weird hours or be out all night. I would take the pink line to and from work. At this point in my life, I was pretty used to being catcalled while walking down the street. I'd been flashed on public transportation a few times. Men would bump into me from behind on packed trains. Basically the usual amount of sexual harassment for a young woman living in the city. Not much fazed me. Of course it was uncomfortable, but I was never truly terrified. Until one night. That night, I was coming home from work well after midnight. The train car I was in had been empty for most of the ride. One stop before mine, a man gets on and sits down in my car. Reflexively, I look up as this new passenger entered the car. We made eye contact. Immediately, I felt the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. I knew that I made a mistake, and that this might be interpreted as some sort of invitation. I quickly looked away, but I felt him watching me as the train pulled away from the station. Since my stop was only one stop away, I decided to wait until the last second to stand up and exit the car, just in case he tried to follow me. Well, he did. He hung back about 30 feet at first, but I felt the gap between us closing and his footsteps were getting louder. Then I heard him trying to catch my attention, saying, "Hey." He catches up to me, and he starts speaking to me like any other man trying to chat me up would. I still couldn't shake the feeling of genuine fear I had since first locking eyes with him in the train car. He asks where I'm headed, and I told him that I'm going home. He asked if there was anyone waiting up for me this late, and I told him my boyfriend was. In reality, I knew my sister was working a night shift, and that I was going home to an empty apartment. Then, he pulled his shirt to the side, exposing a gun in his waistband. In a joking tone, he said that he would fight my boyfriend for me. I laughed along and just kept walking. We were walking down Cermak, which is a pretty busy street, even that late at night. I knew I couldn't let him follow me to my apartment, so when I came to the cross street where I should have turned, I just kept going straight. Eventually, I had walked far enough that I passed the stop where he had originally got on the train. He had walked alongside me for a while, and then dropped back and followed me for a while and eventually stopped. I thought I would be relieved once I'd shaken him, but as soon as I couldn't see him anymore, my fear only heightened. I still had to double back to my apartment somehow, and the trains had stopped running at 2 a.m. I figure he knew I'd walked too far and would have to turn around, so I thought it was possible he was posted up somewhere on Cermak, waiting for me. I turned off and walked a few blocks north, and then started my 1-mile walk back west towards my apartment. The walk back was excruciating. Since I was now off the main road, it was much darker and there was absolutely nobody around. I kept telling myself that I had to get home safe for my sister, because she'd never be able to live with herself if something happened to me. I kept putting one foot in front of the other, and when I finally made it into my apartment and locked the door behind me, I collapsed into a puddle of tears. 10 years later on, I've never felt fear again like I did that night, and to this day, I've never told my sister about it. So, I used to be a nurse at what one could consider a fairly dated hospital. It was in a rather small town in the Midwest, and it wasn't very well equipped. Even back then, it was dated. Because of its size, there was a ton of gossip and stories that were passed back and forth between the nurses and doctors. And more often than not, at least one person would have a story about some weird paranormal experience they had had at the hospital. A disembodied voice, a phantom touch, those kind of silly things. Things you might expect in a building where things either get better or come to an end for those that visit. I was always a practical person in my approach to the work. Sure, ghosts may exist, but I was more of an ignore it and let's get this done kind of person. And, as it happens to many, many people, I had an experience where that wasn't quite an option. It was a fairly quiet shift, which, when working as a nurse on the night shift, is an absolute blessing. It can also be a curse, because the moment you make that comment, something inevitably happens. We were fairly short-staffed, as always, so I was making rounds through the parts of the facility that were temporarily closed. This may sound silly, but we had to make sure the wing was secure. It may be a quiet town, sure, but there were still rowdy teenagers in town, and we'd had a few break-ins before. Basically, all I had to do was make sure the windows were closed and locked, and make sure that the construction crew hadn't left anything behind from their day work doing the renovations. I went room by room, made my checks, and found nothing out of the ordinary. Until I got to the last room, of course. I opened the door, and was immediately hit with a cold breeze. I thought that maybe the window was open, but when I checked, it was completely secured and shut. While I was checking the window, the door behind me made a creaking sound, and as soon as I turned to look, it slammed shut. I nearly jumped out of my skin when it happened. Definitely not a normal thing, as the doors in this wing had to be pulled shut, like with a slight bit of force. I started to walk toward the door, and after the second step, I felt something grab my ankle, and I tripped, landing face first on the tile. It's important to state that whatever it was that wrapped around my ankle, it felt like it was frozen. It was like an icy hand had reached out of nowhere and twisted its fingers around my leg, causing me to fall. After I fell, I quickly turned to look at what it was that I tripped over. But there was nothing there. Like at all. This room was prepped for renovations, but hadn't been touched. The equipment had mostly been moved out, minus a few things being stored, but everything was back against the wall. There was nothing in the middle of the room to block my path. Then, it got slightly creepier. As I pulled myself up, I noticed what looked like a small piece of notebook paper sitting on the floor near me. I picked it up and unfolded it, and I honestly wish that I hadn't. There was a note that looked like it was written by someone that was struggling to hold the pen, and it said, "I want out. I'm so cold. I'm so lonely." A shiver ran straight down my spine. I pocketed that note and immediately jumped up and ran out of the room, and then speed walked down the hallway, considering my rounds done. Now, obviously, it's possible that this note was left as a joke by a construction worker or another night nurse or something like that. But finding it alongside the chill and being grabbed by nothing was enough for me to be done with it all. Joke or not, it was creepy as hell. And that's kind of it. I know it's a short story, but it scared the hell out of me, and I wanted to share it. The closest thing I experienced after that, before I left, was a lot of creepy whispering. Like voices in the hallway when there was no one around. It was scary, sure, but I can handle that way better than I could handle being grabbed or finding freaky notes like that. I used to live in a small town in Michigan that was surrounded by forest. The woods were literally our backyard playground, and sometimes the backdrops to some strange and unnerving experiences. I've seen UFOs, I've seen creepy people in the woods, and maybe someday I'll write those out, though some of them are pretty basic and uneventful. This experience is also kind of uneventful, but it was weird and I figure it's worth telling because I seriously have no idea what I saw. One afternoon, on spring break, I was incredibly bored, which happened often as a 16-year-old. I was bored to the point that I was thinking about things, and I recalled my dad once telling me about a cave that he and his friends would hang out in and get stoned. My dad was the hippie type. I'm not. But I am into wilderness and wanted to check this cave out to see if it was still there, or if it had collapsed, or whatever. Again, I was a bored teenager and figured I would kill time if nothing else. I only had a rough idea of where the cave was, but I figured I was well versed in the art of hiking, so I would find it eventually. So there I was, in the deep woods with the sunlight gleaming down on everything, and making it a bit warmer than it had been all week. It was eerily quiet out in the woods, but I kind of liked the seclusion. So I pressed on. After a couple of hours, I hit a point where I figured I would find Bigfoot before I found the damn cave. So I took a minute to sit on a stump and eat my sandwich that I'd packed for my lunch. While I was sitting there, just staring out into the woods and gnawing on a ham and cheese sandwich, I heard this strange rustling coming from down in a ravine near me. It was a pretty shallow ravine. It looked like it had been dug up and left for whatever reason. Like someone was going to expand a sewage line in this direction and just gave up. It was pretty wide, like it went on for a while, but it wasn't too deep. Maybe 5 foot at most. I figured the rustling was a deer or some small animal, and I was curious, so I went to check it out. I crouched down to be small and quiet as I could, and walked over to the edge to see if I could spot it, thinking I was going to see a deer or a raccoon or something like that. What I saw, though, I have never been able to identify. This thing, whatever the hell it was, slinked out of a small brush in the ravine, and then stood up. When I say stood up, I mean that it was crawling on all fours, and then stood up on 2 and started walking normally. Almost human-like. It wasn't very tall, maybe 2 feet at most. It was covered in fur that looked kind of matted, I guess. It looked rough, like it had mange or something like that. When it stood up, I noticed how long its front arms were. They were the length of most of its body. and it looked like they were not part of its normal anatomy. They were thin, bony, whereas its legs and midsection were thicker. It had what looked like inch-long claws at the end of each of these elongated arms. The head was even worse, and more out of place. It looked almost reptilian. It was flat and featureless, and it had some fur, but if I had to place it, I would almost say that it had the head shape of an iguana, or a bearded dragon. Nothing about this creature looked right. I sat there and watched it over the edge of the ravine, trying to figure out what kind of chimera this little beast was. I watched as it reached down into the brush, and it grabbed the dead carcass of some small animal, maybe a rabbit or squirrel, and it started eating it, bones and all. It just sat there devouring this seemingly long deceased animal, and I couldn't help but whisper, "What the hell is that?" This is right about the time it perked up and looked back to notice me. The screech this thing let out was mind-numbing. It sounded like a 3-year-old child screeching for their mother. It was high-pitched, loud, and it sent this disgusting chill down my spine. After it screamed, it lifted its arms and actually threw what it was eating at me. It threw the carcass in my direction. I then watched as it got back down to all fours and took off at what I can only describe as an unnatural speed. I ran back to the house, the whole time trying to figure out what kind of messed up, freaky, mutated otter I had just discovered. But otters have faces that are cute and distinguishable, and they don't have long mouths like that thing did. And I don't think they eat dead carcasses. I know raccoons are scavengers, but there's no way this thing was a raccoon. Its arms were way too long and the head was just wrong. I'm thankful that it didn't decide I was a threat, because if it had rushed at me with those claws, I don't think I would have gotten away unscathed. If anyone has seen this thing up in Michigan, please let me know. And if anyone has seen it anywhere else, well, then that means there's more than one of these, and that's a terrifying thing to consider. Hi, Raven. I discovered your channel a few months ago and really enjoy your content. There will be 3 separate stories here, as they are all very short. The first one happened over 18 years ago. At the time, I was working a night audit shift for a hotel right outside the city of Pittsburgh. This particular night was busy for us, as it was New Year's Eve. Lots of people were coming in and out of the main lobby for pretty much the whole night, going to and from their parties or to the bars, and it was a busy night for me. Around 1 a.m. or so, a tall, thin man came in appearing to be in distress and out of breath. He approached the front desk, which I was standing behind, and he told me that he needed a cab. His tone was urgent, but I couldn't figure out why. He didn't mention his car breaking down or where he was going either, so I wasn't sure why he needed a cab exactly. He also failed to give me a name and a room number, so I didn't know if the man was staying with us. Come to think of it, why did he ask a hotel for a cab when there was a 24-hour gas station right up the road? It became obvious quickly that he was not a guest at our hotel, so I was suspicious. Yet I wanted him out of my hair, so I figured I would call a cab and have him wait outside. Again, this was a very busy and stressful night for me, and besides that, I was suspicious and figured calling a cab for him might defuse him. Anyway, after he asked for a cab, I sat down and lifted the receiver to my ear and started to dial yellow cab, but stopped after the man said something else to interrupt me. "You aren't calling the police, are you?" he asked. I glanced up at him. My pulse raced when I saw the menacing in his eyes, and his face was beet red. I leaned back in my chair, unsure of what the man would do. I denied calling the police to him, but the man continued to stare me down. "Don't lie to me," he said. Again, I denied it, but it was clear that he didn't believe me. When he finally turned around and stormed out, relief washed over me, even though he called me an expletive as he walked through the door. I could easily let the cussing me out part roll off my back knowing he was gone, and thankfully would never come back. In retrospect, there's no telling what the man would do if there hadn't been so many people around to witness it. He may have just been a man drunk on New Year's Eve looking to get home. On the other hand, working the night shift had made me familiar with the smell of alcohol on someone's breath, and I don't recall smelling it. He may have been on something stronger, something that may have made him aggressive. Either way, in that situation, it made working the night shift each night by me for so long all the scarier. The next story took place about 4 years after the first one. It was 2010, and again I had the night audit position, this time at a different hotel, about 12 minutes from Pittsburgh International Airport. This hotel had a business center where our guests could print up their boarding passes for their flights. One night, a man came in around 3 a.m. and said he needed to use a computer. I had my suspicions, but I gave him directions to the business center anyway. "It's down the hall on the left," I told him. I figured giving him the benefit of the doubt was a better approach than being suspicious without legit cause. He thanked me and went down, trying to get in, but couldn't because he had no key. He returned a few minutes later and said, "It's locked." "You'll need your room key to access the room," I responded. "I don't think you understand. I'm not a guest at this hotel." I then immediately informed him that the business center is only for our guests. He shook his head. "It'd only take a few minutes. I just need to do one thing." "Sorry," I said, "but if you're not a guest here, you'll have to leave." I waited silently for a long minute before the man left the premises and didn't come back. The encounter wasn't all that scary, but it still creeped me out. I wondered why the guy, being a non-guest, would come into some hotel and ask to use a computer just out of the blue, especially in the middle of the night like that. This last story will be brief. That same night, another man came in and approached the front desk. He looked anxious and fumbled for words for a bit, before managing to spit out that he needed to use the bathroom. Well, I was 1 for 0 in my strange encounters for the night, but I didn't want to push my luck, so I let him use it. He walked to the bathroom, which was in the hall beside our front desk, and then left without incident. It was uneventful in the end, but I couldn't help but wonder if the guy had planned on doing something to me, but maybe chickened out at the last minute. What would he have done? Possibly held me at gunpoint to rob me? And I didn't want to think of the other possibilities. The encounters I had with strangers that night, and the first one, are reminders that we're not always safe during the night shift, even if we feel that we are. Especially when you work with the public all night, as I did in those years. If you're listening to this, and you work at night, remember to always be on your guard. In fact, it's better to have someone working with you instead of just being by yourself. Because when you're in that situation, someone might come along and try to take advantage of you. Don't be fooled into thinking that just because you work in a well-lit area and are around other 24-hour businesses, that you aren't vulnerable to horrible people. I am a female. When I was 16, I lived in the Valley area of Los Angeles. This was many years ago. As I explained in another story, at this time, the best part of my week was Saturday nights when I would meet my friends at our beloved Under 21 nightclub to dance the night away. The vast majority of the time, I'd have to get a ride there and back. I didn't have my own car until a couple of years later when I was in college. But occasionally, a family friend would lend me his car, and on one of these Saturday nights, he did. I felt so independent and free to be able to take myself to the club, and to be able to leave when I wanted. On the night of this story, I drove to the club and had a typically great time, dancing with my group of friends to music like Prince and Earth, Wind and Fire. At the end of the night, I got into my borrowed car and headed toward home. In case you don't know, the San Fernando Valley is made up of many suburban towns. None are really small, and some are very nice. And, as you would expect, some are less nice with higher crime. I lived with my family in a medium town in the northern part of the valley. It was neither very nice nor very bad, with medium homes on mostly respectable, if not professionally manicured lawns. And being the greater Los Angeles area, there were many differing routes I could take to get home, whether freeways, highways, or city streets. It was after midnight at this time, but most routes that I could take would still be bustling on a Saturday night. I'd had my fill of loud music, laughter, and chattering voices, so I opted for a quieter route home. I took some busy streets and then veered into some quiet neighborhoods that would take me home. If I drove through some quiet house-lined streets, I would get home a little faster, and I was tired. GPS wasn't in use at this time, nor were cell phones, so I had to rely on maps or just knowing the chosen route. I had heard bad things about a town called Pacoima, but I'd only been through it during the day, maybe once. Still, I knew how to get through to shave a few minutes off of my time, and besides, being someone used to walking or taking buses, I felt blissfully perfectly safe now in a well-running car with gas in the tank. I was safer at this moment than at almost any other time. At least, that's what I believed. Still, I was a teenage girl alone after midnight, in an area that I was unfamiliar with, and naive enough to think that nothing bad could happen to me in a locked car. I entered a residential street in Pacoima, and only had to go a couple of blocks to get to the next town and then to my own. As I slowly drove down a dark, quiet avenue of modest homes, there were streetlights illuminating the unknown. And this also helped with my feeling of invincibility. As I smiled to myself at this, I started to notice a few people walking down the street toward me. At first, I didn't give it much notice. My left turn out of Pacoima was coming up just ahead anyways. But as I got closer, I quickly realized it wasn't just a few people. It was a gang of approximately 12 to 15 men. And they weren't casually walking down the sidewalk, they were aggressively running down the middle of the street, and right towards me. I suddenly had to slow to almost a stop so as to not hit anyone, and this is when they all got a real good look at me. Looks which turned instantly more excited and animated as they realized I was just a young girl, alone. Many exchanged smiling glances between them, and others were whooping, whistling, and calling things out to me. Smoothly, effortlessly, as if they had rehearsed ahead of time, several of them stopped me completely by standing right in front of my car, even putting hands on the hood as others walked around to my driver and passenger doors and pulled the handles to open the door. I didn't always lock the doors when I drove, and cars didn't have auto door locks back then, but I was thanking God that I had the foresight to do so on this night. Of course, it all happened very fast, but in my shock and terror it felt like slow motion. So quickly adjusting my mind from carefree to possibly being abducted or worse by this large group of men, they had me trapped. I couldn't drive forward nor reverse out of there, because at this time, the car was completely surrounded by these men. And as a couple of guys picked up sticks or other objects to try to bust in my windows, I knew that I had to think clearly and act fast. I did the only thing I could think of. I started driving forward. Having blocked my car completely, I could see the surprise in some of their faces as they knew they had to move out of my way or risk being run over. I had immediately decided that if they didn't move, I would run them over. All of the men standing in front of my car quickly jumped out of the way, and I sped up as I took the left turn out of Pacoima. I did make it home safely, but my heart didn't stop beating out of my chest for the rest of the night. Of course, I thought about it for a long time after as well. I felt proud of the way I'd handled the situation, but I kept running through possibilities of what I could have done differently. What if they didn't get out of the way and I actually had to hit someone with my car? How would I have lived with myself? What if one of the men had pointed a gun at me? I'm very happy that it turned out the way that it did, but it could have turned out so much worse. So, I hope we all keep in mind that we're not quite invincible inside a car, no matter how cozy even heated leather seats may make us feel. Dark, quiet shortcuts are not a good idea, especially late at night. And always drive with your doors locked. So Pacoima gang that tried to grab and do who knows what to a teenage girl, driving alone late one Saturday night. It's been a long time since then, and I'm very glad that I didn't meet any of you ever again. Hey Raven, I wanted to share a story from when I started working at this first hospital since getting my RN license. I was delegated to an elderly gentleman, Roger, that had been in a coma for a few months. He'd been ill. His wife described him as just feeling like he had a cold. This was back in 2012, by the way. And then he was rushed to the hospital as he had a stroke, putting him in a coma. Roger had several underlying conditions, and after a previous serious health issue, he and his wife had both agreed to sign DNR forms in case anything else would happen. After he went into the coma, his wife understood the chances of him waking up, but wanted to give it some time just in case. I had met Roger when he came in for the stroke. He obviously didn't speak, but I saw him conscious and was helping where I could. The following months were pretty routine. We checked his vitals, moved him to prevent sores, cleaned him, everything we would normally do for our coma patients. Sometimes his wife Sharon was there, or a couple others that I learned were Roger's siblings. Roger was stable, but that was it. He wasn't showing any signs of improving, or coming out of the coma. So the mood of the room would shift from being optimistic, talking to Roger like he was there, to being more melancholy at times. And it was understandable. You have to remain realistic in those moments, because giving someone too much hope could have negative effects. It can be hard, and it definitely was harder in the beginning, but it does get easier. Anyways, to move on to the reason for this story. I was doing my rounds when I came across Roger's room. I went in and started my checklist of things to do. While I was writing numbers down and checking his vitals, I heard a quiet, raspy voice. Nurse? Other than Roger, I was the only one in the room, so I wasn't expecting anyone in there. It made me jump a bit, but I turned to look for the source, and to my surprise, I saw Roger with his eyes open, looking straight at me. I composed myself and smiled and asked how he was feeling and how long he had been awake. He gave simple answers, smiling, saying that he heard me come in and that's when he woke up. He said he felt tired and we had a small conversation as I physically checked him out. While we spoke, I called for assistance, telling a nurse to get the doctor since he was awake. Shortly after I called for them, I tried to ask him something else, but he held his hand up, as if to stop me, and opened his mouth to speak. No, I don't have long. Just tell Cassie to go with the pink one, please. I know that's what she really wants, and I want her to be happy. I was confused as I hadn't met anyone that visited by the name of Cassie. I was also confused by his statement. He was in a coma, but he was now awake and seemed fine. Or as fine as you could be from waking up from a 2-month coma. But before I could question him, his eyes fluttered until they closed, and he flatlined. I called for help again, coding what was happening, but when the head nurse came in, due to the DNR request, we couldn't do much. We had to call the time of death and start the process of calling his wife and the works. His wife had just left maybe an hour or so before I was in there, as she told the nurse at the station that she was going to go home to shower and get some more clothes. She often stayed the night 2 or 3 times a week. Shortly after, Sharon, Roger's sister Barb, and a younger girl showed up in tears. Sharon seemed a bit more controlled. I think she was expecting the inevitable, which seemed to make it easier on her. We hadn't even moved Roger out yet, so they said their goodbyes there as we all finished in the room. Some people handle it better than others, but by the time the guys came in to collect Roger, they were all in better spirits, seeming to tell stories about Roger. We told them they could leave the room while they collected him, but they said they were okay with it. And that's when I heard Barb say the name Cassie, as she talked to the younger woman. It made me think about what Roger had said to me. I shouldn't have been eavesdropping, but as they talked and I thought about it more, it dug at me that I needed to tell them. I was always told about how being a nurse could be a fine line. Some people liked the nurses being involved and being personable, while others preferred that we just did our jobs and left. And being that this was the first hospital I worked at, I didn't want to mess up and get a warning, or even fired. But I knew from their conversation that they were pretty spiritual people, and laughed about Roger watching them and made a joke to Cassie about him teasing her for it. So, I felt my chances of them accepting what I said was pretty good, so I went for it. I turned and apologized for interrupting, but I asked to confirm if the younger woman was Cassie, and they confirmed, saying she was Roger's niece, Barb's daughter. Roger and Sharon didn't have any kids, but he spoiled Cassie like she was his own. So, I told them that right before he passed, he woke up, and that he told me something. As I explained this, Barb and Sharon looked surprised while Cassie's eyes filled with tears, smiling. She explained that she announced that she was engaged shortly before Roger had his stroke, and her own father wasn't in the picture, so he was going to walk her down the aisle. He even agreed to pay for some of the wedding, but she had been dress shopping and was torn. Her mom wanted her to get a traditional white dress while she wanted a pink dress, and couldn't decide. They all claim they never spoke about the conundrum while at the hospital, however, so they have no idea how he would have known. But they knew now that they had to go with the pink one. I was very happy that I shared that message with them, and that they handled it well. But for being so early in my career, it was a pretty powerful moment for me. Obviously, I never found out what she did end up doing or how it all turned out, but I'm sure Roger was still with them in spirit, celebrating. I've had some crazy stories since I've been a nurse so long and worked in so many different places. I may share more of them eventually, if you or your audience are interested. I know that this wasn't exactly spooky, but I still thought it was pretty bizarre. So, I thought that you all would still enjoy it as much as I did. Hello, Raven. Thank you for doing such great work. I hope you're having a great start to the year. I am, though. It's March, so I'm not sure if it's really the start anymore. I thought about sending you this story, but I needed to check my facts with my sister beforehand. This was in the early 90s, and I don't remember why my sister and I were home alone. My sister was around 14 years old, and I was 11. At this time, we lived in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, and we were bored. We decided to take a walk. After leaving a note for my mom, we took off. Now, this town was about 20 houses at most. The only thing it had was a post office. There was an old school that was overgrown but had a basketball hoop that was still standing. We walked past the school and made our way to an old rail crossing. The tracks had been removed, but it had not gotten overgrown yet. We followed the old trail deeper into the woods and caught sight of a rock wall that looked easy to climb. So we decided to climb up and see what we could see. The climb was taller than we thought. It was only about 100 feet or so, but it was steep. I think it was a hill that the rail company had blasted out of the way. This left a rugged cliff that was pretty sheer. The old drill holes left us a way to climb. They had rough edges that we could grab. This made the climb seem easier than it really was. As we were going up, my sister had knocked a rock loose that hit me in my face and knocked my glasses off. I had wanted to stop then, to at least get my glasses, but my sister just said that we would get them on the way back. At the top of the hill, we realized that it was the edge of a plateau, I guess. It was a flat spot that had been cleared by logging. It's hard to explain. From below it looked like a small hill, and that we would get a good look of the valley. Instead, it was a foothill of a small mountain range. This flat spot leading to mountains in the distance. There were no trees left standing. All the trunks were grayed and decaying. The undergrowth had run rampant. Vines tried to catch your feet. Old sticks covered holes in the ground. It would have been so easy to turn an ankle or break a leg. We wandered for a while and noticed it was getting dark. We needed to get home. I think we were already late. Our mom was going to be worried. We hadn't marked our trails, so it took some time to find our way back to where we came up. Looking around was hard for me. Without my glasses, anything outside of 3 feet was blurry. When we made it back, I was trying to find a place to climb down, or at least where we climbed up. When we couldn't figure it out, my sister suggested jumping. Without my glasses, I couldn't tell if it was a really long way down or not, but I was not going to jump. We stood there and argued for a time. I finally told her, "Jump if you want. I'm gonna find a house and ask to use the phone." I started to walk away, afraid that my sister was going to jump. She was headstrong like that, but she followed. I had a hard time in the dark. Neither of us thought to bring flashlights. Eventually we found a house with lights on. Apparently, either people went to bed early around here, or it was mostly vacation homes. I was almost ready to try to break into a house, just to use the phone. My sister took the lead and knocked on the door. A nice woman answered the door. She wouldn't let us inside because her daughter was sick with a fever and she didn't want to pass it on to us. So she brought out her phone. She even wiped it with alcohol before handing it over. My sister left a message for my mom. She was out looking for us, and handed the phone back. The woman asked if we were able to get a hold of our mom, and my sister said no. The lady asked us what we wanted to do, and I said, "If you can point us to our town, we'll start walking." I didn't think we could be that far from home since we walked here. When I told her what town we were from, she was shocked. Apparently going over the cliff and through the flat rise took us about 25 minutes from our town by car. The road back had to go around the rise and then double back to get to our house. When we said that we would start walking, she objected. She went back inside real quick and checked on her child, and she then told us that she would drive us home. The lady was so nice. She left her sick kid at home to drive us lost kids home. When we got home, our car wasn't in the driveway. But not 5 seconds after, our mom pulled up. Mom was so happy to see us. Apparently she'd been out driving the route we said we were going to use in our note. From what she said, she'd been driving on the shoulder at like 5 miles an hour trying to find us. Not only that, but our little lapdog Holly, who was the size of a cat, was sniffing the air and barking like she smelled us. My mom would stop the car and get out to let Holly try and find us. She'd been coming back every so often to check the phone or see if we made it home. So, when we were standing in the driveway, she rushed to hug us. After exchanging some words with the lady and profusely thanking her, Mom let the lady leave. The next day, we went to look for my glasses, because we couldn't afford to buy new ones. When my sister saw the cliff and how high it was, she looked at me and said, "I'm glad you talked me out of jumping." When my mom heard this, she looked mortified. "You thought about jumping down? That's like 100 feet. In reality, it was only about half that. It's still enough to seriously damage or kill us. At the base of the cliff, we found my glasses too. They only had a small scuff on the metal where the rock had hit them. Anyway, thank you for reading this, Raven, and I'm a huge fan of your work." This happened the summer that I turned 15. And I learned a pretty strong lesson. A lesson that's etched into my very bones, and a reminder that sometimes you should just mind your own business. Being a teenager, I thought that I was invincible, and that I would never be confronted with the horrors of the world. Scary things only happened on TV and whatnot. Obviously, anyone can experience scary things, but it's probably important to highlight that I had this dumb, invincible mentality as a 15-year-old girl, which, I would say, made me way more vulnerable than a lot of people. And some of the things I did were incredibly stupid. This was one of those stupid things. My name is Riley, and back then, my whole world was a small town cradled in a lot of forest and state preserve that hadn't yet been turned into shopping centers. That summer, I landed a pretty decent summer job at the only diner in town. It's not relevant, but I loved that job, because people knew that I was a high schooler, and they tipped super well when I told them that I was trying to save up to buy a car for my 16th birthday. I was hired on to the late morning to afternoon and early evening shift, so I had to be there typically by 9 a.m. Obviously, I didn't have a car, and both of my parents worked, so I typically walked or cycled to the diner. When I walked, I would typically go down a path in the woods, because it was quicker, and there was a lot of wildlife to enjoy. I would take the trails until they got to a small railroad track, and then take a left to follow the track to the diner, which was right next to them on the main road. The whole shortcut took about a half mile off of my trip, which, to a 15-year-old, is a lot. I took this trail for about 2 weeks, which I guess lulled me into more of a false sense of security. Nothing had happened yet, so nothing would happen, right? There were a few times while walking the trail that I felt like I was being watched, or like somebody was nearby, but I never saw anyone, so I gradually convinced myself that it was a deer or something like that, and I was just being paranoid because of how secluded and quiet the trail was. Again, nothing could happen to Riley. Then, one day, that illusion of seclusion and safety shattered. I was walking the path like normal, when I paused because something looked out of place. For more than 14 days, I did this walk on the trail and nothing had changed. Then there was suddenly something different. Off to the side of the railroad track, a few feet away, was what looked like a lawn chair with a backpack sitting in it. I know now that I should have just kept going, ignoring the chair and the backpack. But I was curious as to why someone would have left a backpack by the tracks like that. I took a second to think about it, and I figured I would look into the pack, justifying it by saying that I could see if I could find an ID in it and return it to whoever owned it. Surely that was the right thing to do. I say now with very heavy sarcasm. So, I stepped over to the backpack, and I unzipped it, thinking it would be full of someone's paperwork, or clothing or something. Boy was I surprised when I found it full of several tightly wrapped and taped bricks of a white powder of some sort. I now know what it was, yes, but at the time I was sitting there thinking, who put a backpack full of powdered sugar on a lawn chair in the woods? I didn't touch any of the bricks. I just stared at them for a second and tried to piece it together. My thoughts were then broken by the sound of footsteps behind me, and the feeling of something cold and metal being jammed against the back of my head. If you've never had a gun pushed against your scalp, it's a strange feeling that you instantly recognize as a gun. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's almost like the feeling of a gun barrel is an instinctual trigger in your brain. Like you just know that it's a gun and that you're about to die. As soon as the gun hit my head, I threw my hands up and yelped, only for a hand to go over my mouth. The person behind me was very quiet and meticulous as he spoke. Do not scream. You scream, you die. I nodded softly and he moved his hand away and then continued. What's your name? I told him that my name was Riley, and that I didn't mean to touch his stuff, that I was just stupid and curious. He ignored my comment and asked me how old I was, and to this day, I cannot help but laugh at my stupid answers. I told him that I was 15, and then rambled on that I was going to be 16 in October, as if the fact that I was going on 16 was going to mean anything else. He gave a slight chuckle and then said, Okay, and where do you live, Riley? I told him that I lived at the end of the path, and that I was just walking to work. He cut me off and said, No, address. I want your address. I wasn't sure what to do, but when you think you're about to die, you tend to kind of just go along with it. I told him my exact street address and said that it was a bright blue house, like it really mattered. He then replied with, All right, Riley, I now know where you live. You look like a good kid, a smart kid, and I can understand that you were curious. It was a mistake, but I think this is a good educational moment for you. So I want you to listen to what I tell you and really understand it, okay? Despite the edge and aggression in his voice, I remember that he almost sounded sympathetic, like he felt sorry for me being in this situation. I just nodded in agreement, and he then finished his side of the conversation. You're going to keep walking forward. You're going to go to work, and you're going to live your day like nothing ever happened. You will not turn around. You will not look back. If you look back, or I think that you even got the slightest look at my face, I will kill you. You were never here, you never saw the backpack, and this morning never happened. Do you understand? I once again nodded emphatically, trying to convince him that I was more than willing to do what he was asking. Okay, good. Good girl, Riley. I'm also going to need you to promise me that you aren't going to go to the cops about this, or tell anyone that might. Because if you do, I will know. And I know where you live. I'm also going to have to ask you to not take this trail for the rest of the month. until the 1st of July. After that, I don't care if you take it again, but until then, you find another way to work. Do you understand?" When he said this, I actually spoke and said, "Yes, sir, I understand." He gave a slight chuckle, and then told me that I was going to be okay, and then told me to go, and to remember what he said. I absolutely remembered, and there was no way that I would literally ever forget those words, because I knew right then that he was completely serious. He would come to my house if I told anyone about it, and I wasn't going to risk it. I didn't look back. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes forward and walked down the track to work and just lived as normal. I don't know who this man was. I never figured out who in town it could have been. And honestly, I prefer it that way. I'm fine with never knowing. I never told the cops. I never told my parents or my friends. I told no one about this until I was much, much older and had moved far away from town. I learned a very valuable lesson that day. The main one being that minding your own business is a big deal, and if you decide that you're not going to, it could lead to a gun to the back of your head. I'm strangely grateful that this guy realized I was just a dumb kid, and that I had made a mistake, because he could have easily pulled the trigger and dumped my body, and I would not have been found for a couple of days at most. It's strange to say that you're grateful that the person threatening your life decided you weren't worth the bullet, but that's where I ended up with my experience. Hey Raven, I saw your post about stories, and I thought about this trip that I took with my friends back in 2019, and thought you might be interested in it. 3 of my friends, Mason, Andrew, and Phil, and myself, all went camping during our spring break. We were all going to the same uni, but we pretty much kept to ourselves. We were far from the popular crowd, but we still liked to do crazy fun things and to get a little stupid. So, this time, we wanted to go camping, drink, and let loose. We went to a state park that was a few hours away, and found a good place deep in the trees, away from the people. We didn't want someone to report us for being too loud and disruptive, so we tried to stay away from others. Once we got there and set up, all hell broke loose. We probably drank more than we should have, but we stayed at our camp, so I felt that we were safe. We laughed, made fun of each other, vented about the dumb BS we were dealing with at uni. Really, this was a much-needed break for us. But at some point that night, I started hearing what sounded like someone whispering, or talking, just far off. I heard it, and when I noticed Phil cocking his head to the side, I asked if he was hearing it too. He nodded and asked what it was. I shrugged, not knowing what it was, but then we all got quiet. And by the look on their faces, Mason and Andrew must have heard it too. We were in the middle of the woods. We were all intoxicated, and there were still people around somewhere, so we didn't think anything else of it. We just calmed down so we weren't as loud and let it go. Shortly after, we all passed out peacefully. The next morning, I was thankful to wake up without the repercussions of the night prior's drinking, but we couldn't say the same for Andrew. He was feeling it and was not ready to get up yet. So, while he told us to go on without him, deciding to sleep in, we decided to go for a hike. The 3 of us packed our hiking bags and headed off. We were probably about 2 miles away from our campsite. We found a pretty tall rock formation that we climbed over, and saw that there was more forest above. We all agreed to continue through it, wanting to see what we could find. Shortly after entering those trees, the atmosphere seemed to shift. It's hard to explain, and I wish that I had a word for it. It was like being wrapped in a blanket, bathing in the sunlight, and then someone just put a cold, dark metal box over you. Not only was there a shift in temperature, but like being put in a metal box, I also became anxious and was on edge. The density and amount of trees had not changed. There was the same amount of sunlight, yet it felt colder. I looked back at Mason and Phil, and they agreed. Something was different, too. However, we wanted to continue on, determined to figure out the cause of the shift. As we walked deeper into the woods, we started hearing the familiar sounds from the night prior. The muffled talking. We figured we were probably close to some other campers. It seemed like a weird spot, and we became curious how they got there. Did they walk all that way and climb up here to camp? Was there a road somewhere that led up there and we were just oblivious? So we continued on. We walked a little further and the talking became clearer and clearer until we found the source. Through the trees, we spotted not only people, but a whole damn village. But these people did not look normal, or at least not modern. They were in old-fashioned style clothing, think Little House on the Prairie style. The tall hats, bonnets, and all. We just stood by the trees, watching them from where we were. We could hear them talk better, and while they were speaking English, it still sounded old, if that made sense. They were carrying buckets, wheelbarrows, and one of the women was even sitting in front of a small house, washing or doing something to some clothes. What were we witnessing? There were several houses there. Did we just manage to stumble on a neighborhood? Maybe it bumped up to the back of the park. But with the shift in the atmosphere, something still was not sitting right to me. Part of me wanted to approach them and ask about it, but Mason's mouth works faster than my brain, and he very loudly made a comment about the weird-looking hats. Phil and I cringed and looked at him, but then noticed how quiet it grew, and looked back at the village. To my embarrassment, they were all looking at us. But they looked at us like they were bewildered, or maybe even scared, I guess. If all you've ever seen were people dressed like you, and then you saw someone who looked so different, maybe you would have the same reaction. Either way, something was not right, and them being able to see us seemed to make the situation worse. I felt like we needed to get out of there sooner rather than later. I elbowed the other two so we could leave, and they finally agreed. We slowly walked back the way that we entered, climbed down the cliff, and went back to our camp. It didn't seem to take as long. Maybe because we walked a little faster, but once back, Andrew was awake, so we explained to him what we saw. He thought that it sounded interesting, and he wanted to see it too. So we all agreed to show him the next day. We were all hungry and tired at that point. The next day, we set off to find the place, this time with our phones with us, wanting to take a few pictures. We typically left them at the camp because the signal was so shoddy. There was no point in carrying them, but once we got to the area, it was just trees. There was no sign of the village. We traced our steps almost to a T. We climbed the same cliff. We could even see the marks that we left in it. We walked through the same trees, making out the flattened part of the grass and fallen leaves, but when we got through the trees, there were nothing but large boulders and more trees. We circled around the area thinking maybe we were somehow off, but we never found it. And that change in the atmosphere wasn't there like last time either. How could a whole village just disappear? Andrew thought we were screwing with him at first, trying to make him feel bad for staying behind. But after a little convincing and us all bringing up the same things, explaining things similarly, he believed us. We went back to our camp once again, completely stumped at what we experienced. After we left, we tried doing some research on the place to see if there was anything about an old town that used to be there, or maybe some kind of show. But we found nothing. We all still bring this up and want to go back, but we haven't had the time since. I really want to know if we saw something we shouldn't have. Like we stepped into another place in time, but I can't even tie a community to this park. If anyone else has experienced something similar, I would love to hear about it. To quote Mr. Stack, maybe someone out there has an answer to our mystery. I'm adding a quick warning to this story, as this is one of these stories that does contain very sensitive subject matter, specifically sexual abuse. The OP also added a trigger warning at the beginning, and I will read it, but this warning is included as well. Warning. This contains the very touchy subject of sexual abuse. Don't read it if it might trigger you. I care for all women and men who have been victimized. Just remember that we are strong and we are survivors. I'm a female. When I was 16, I wasn't very happy. I hated school. I didn't have a boyfriend. The only thing I looked forward to was Saturday nights at my favorite disco/teen nightclub. I didn't have a car, and I had a few friends who would drive me, but I would be devastated if I missed a week. It seems so trivial now, but it was all I felt I had going on in my life at the time. So, occasionally, when I couldn't get a ride, my mom would drop me off as I promised her one of my friends would drive me home. That worked for well over a year. My friends were always there, and one of them always was able to drive me home. Until one night. On this night, I asked my friend Elle. She couldn't that night, so I asked my friend why. She was riding with Elle. For whatever reason, C couldn't either. My friend T also said no. The same with A and J. Crazy that this had never happened before. I couldn't call my mom to come get me because I knew she wouldn't let me go out again for a long time. And sad, desperate people do dumb, desperate things. By the end of the night, I approached the only person I knew that I hadn't yet asked for a ride. I knew him, but we weren't close friends. He agreed. But he wasn't driving. He was riding with two other guys whom I didn't know. I was hesitant, but desperate. I got into the back seat with the guy that I knew, and I immediately tried to befriend the guys in the front with many thank yous and, oh, you're a lifesaver. Almost immediately, they came back with, you owe us. We're going to drive up to the mountains where you'll repay our kindness. The guy I knew in the back seat with me didn't say anything. He didn't feel that he had a voice between these particular guys, and he was a coward. I was on my own. We'd only gone about a mile at this point, and I told them, no, let me out of the car. And they laughed, drove me back to the nightclub, let me out of the car, and drove away, continuing to laugh. By this time, the club was completely closed. I was all alone in the dark parking lot out front. My favorite place had never felt so ominous before, with nothing but a single streetlight. This was many years ago, and cell phones weren't really a thing. I would have to walk who knows how far in the dark to find a phone booth, and there was nothing around this place. I had no money, and buses didn't run this late. And did I mention that this was on the outskirts of Los Angeles? A huge area with some dark, sketchy, deserted places, especially after midnight. Well, I was in such a place. Just as I was about to panic, a car drove into the lot and a man got out, ignoring me and walking up to the door to see if the club was still open. I told him it was closed. Then, since he had initially ignored me, I felt that he couldn't be a creep. He wasn't looking for a 16-year-old girl, right? So, I asked him if he would drive me home. Stupid, I know. And the adult me is horrified and ashamed that I took such risks back then. and forever grateful that I survived. Anyway, I thought this guy was alone, but as we approached the car, I saw that there were 2 other men in it. If I'd known, I wouldn't have asked for a ride, and I was immediately regretting the question. The guy leaned in to talk to the other men, and they had a short discussion about me that I couldn't hear. Now, this is relevant. They were all African American men, so I felt that they would feel that I was racist or disrespecting them if I changed my mind now. It mattered to me to show them that I wasn't racist, so I got into the back seat. It was a 2-door car, so I couldn't have jumped out if I needed to. Incredibly dumb decision, I know. I tried the same tactic that hadn't worked with the first men, thinking I would befriend them. I told them that all my friends had left and I was going to ride with some other guys, but they were talking about taking me to the mountains and such. I hoped it would inspire sympathy for the poor, dumb teenager. It did not. The driver was clearly the boss. He had very direct, sharp, and memorable eyes that I knew I would never forget. He said, "We were kind of thinking the same thing." I froze, terrified, and trapped in the back seat without a door with 3 complete strangers who were possibly going to assault me, maybe kill me. He continued with, "We're going to take you to a parking lot, and then you're going to have sex with us." He then stopped in a dark parking lot a few miles from the club. As he got out of the car and took me with him, he said to the other 2 men, "Don't say my name." He threw me out onto some concrete steps. I was wearing a short dress, so it was easy for him to get to me. I tried to fight, but I knew it was completely futile. He began to assault me, and I cried and prayed out loud. As I tried not to think of what was happening, I just kept praying aloud. And suddenly, he stopped. He said, "I'm not going to finish. I'm going to let you go. It's because you were praying." He then got into the car and drove off, not letting the other men touch me. As they drove away, I was still terrified, thinking they might shoot me just to get rid of the witness. Thankfully, they just left me crying, dirty, and traumatized. And still, in the same situation. I still didn't have a way home, and I lived a good 20 or more miles away. I finally got myself up and began walking into the darkness, crying, achy, and bruised, until I saw the lights of an all-night diner ahead in the distance. I just went towards the lights, not knowing what to do, except to make it to the lights. When I got there, the place wasn't busy, which made me feel relieved, as I knew that I must look a scary mess. I went to the phone and I still wouldn't call my mom. I knew she'd be asleep, and especially now that it was over an hour since I should have been home, she'd be angry, and she would take away my club privileges. As nightmarish as that night had been, going out one night a week was still all I had left in my life. See, at that time in my life, I consciously believed and repeated to myself that if I completely disappeared off the earth, no one, not even my busy single mom or brother who hated me, no one would even notice that I was gone. So, I called one last good friend with a car. He lived all the way in Pasadena, far from where I was. He answered, but said that he was asleep, and that the drive was just too far. Even though I told him that something really bad had happened to me, he refused. See, the lack of people who cared deeply about me was part of why I felt I had nothing in my life. So I did the last thing that I could do. I sat at a table and talked to the restaurant manager. Since she was a stranger to me, I didn't mind telling her the whole story. Every awful thing that had happened that night. She was appalled and very compassionate. She asked one of her most trusted employees to drive me home, and he did. I arrived safely at home, and I was never as happy to be there as I was in that moment. I never told any of my friends what happened to me that night, and to this day, my mom doesn't know. I felt so ashamed and stupid for making all the wrong decisions that night, and actually almost counted myself lucky that it hadn't been much worse. I didn't go to the police because I didn't want anyone to know, and anyway, I had no way to identify those men. I continued to go to that club, but only when I arranged for a ride home in advance. And here's the very weird denouement. Remember the friend that I'd called who wouldn't come get me? A couple weeks later, he told me that he'd heard I'd gotten a ride with Mark D, a member of a very famous singing family at the time. I looked at a photo I found of the group, and indeed, I saw those sharp eyes that I would never forget. And that's why he said to the two other guys, "Don't say my name." And that's why he was the leader in that group of friends. The one thing I will never understand, though, is how did he know my name? How did he tell someone who knew me that he had given me a ride? This was a very long time ago, like I said. 1981 to be exact. I'm a much different, strong, independent woman now, so these things don't hurt me to recall. I did always want to tell the world what the famous Mark D did to me, but I didn't. That's okay. I would probably fully name him here if I thought it was allowed, but this is my first Reddit post and I don't know much. I just want all the young people now to know what I didn't know back then. Always listen to your gut. That cannot be overstated enough. And never ride with strangers. It sounds so simple, and situations like mine are all different. But your life is worth so much more than anything else. Like that stupid nightclub that I thought was so important then. Thank you for reading my story. A couple years back, my girlfriend and I made plans for a fun little spring break trip. Her birthday was going to fall right in the middle of it, so I thought it would be a perfect combo vacation for it too. We wanted to go somewhere warm and sunny, both wanting a break from the cold, gloomy Oregon, but also somewhere that wasn't going to be heavily populated like Miami. So, we decided on a nice little area in South Carolina. We flew, anticipating just getting an Uber anytime we went far, but the area we were going to be staying in had a great food and shopping district, with most of it within walking distance. It was one of the reasons we chose it. We were both avid runners, so being on our feet all day never bothered us. Upon arriving, the hotel was much nicer than anticipated. I almost panicked thinking I accidentally booked the wrong one, but the receipt they gave to the front desk confirmed it. We got our room, which was just as nice, and Hazel loved it, which was the most important to me. Once we got settled into our room, we decided to take it easy that night. We went swimming in the hotel pool, had drinks at their bar, and had the best nachos to go with it. We ended our night back in our room, watching some shows as we fell asleep. We got a late start the following morning, probably just being worn out from the flight and everything catching up to us. After breakfast, we wanted to check out some of the nearby shops, so we set out on foot. As we left the first store, there was a guy sitting on a bench that we walked past. He looked a little rough, but he didn't look homeless. I say this because where we live, we see that a lot. I'm also aware that some people just take care of themselves better than others. He just looked like he had one hell of a night and was trying to recover from it. His short dark hair looked dirty and was sticking up everywhere. He had on jeans that were also dirty and caked with mud on the bottom, and he was wearing a button-up blue-collared shirt. Other than the collared shirt, I would assume that he just did some kind of construction work. He also had a cigarette hanging from his mouth and a smartphone in his hands, staring at it. As we passed by, we were in conversation, and he did a double take, looking at us. When we got close enough, he waved, saying, "Hey," in a soft tone, obviously trying to get our attention. We both slowed down but didn't stop, and looked in his direction. "You ladies wouldn't happen to have a lighter on you, would you?" We both shook no, neither of us being smokers. He smiled and said he figured, claiming we looked too good to be smokers, and then laughed, warning us to never start up. Hazel commented that it was never too late to stop, and he laughed again. After wishing each other a good day, he looked back down at his phone and we continued on. The rest of the day went fine. We saw the guy sitting on that same bench, still with an unlit cigarette in his mouth twice more. But he didn't stop us or say anything else to us. I just remembered mentioning to myself that he had been out there for hours, which was odd, but nothing too crazy. We went back to our hotel and had dinner at the restaurant there. But then, the next day, was when things took a turn. It started out normal. We actually took an Uber to the beach and spent most of the day there. The weather was sunny and warm with just a pinch of chill in the air, plus it wasn't crowded at all, which made for the perfect day. We got back to the hotel around 4 and cleaned up so we could go have dinner. The following day was Hazel's birthday, and I was planning a special day for her. But that night, we agreed to try out a local bar and grill. We made our way out of the hotel and headed to our destination on foot. Due to previous experiences in the past, I've become acutely aware of my surroundings. People, animals, buildings, as well as sounds and smells that may affect me. I don't assume everyone that I don't know is suspicious or dangerous, but I do think it's important to know what's around you, if that makes sense. Now, I will also say that Hazel is quite the opposite. I adore her, obviously, but she may be a bit more on the naive side of things, so I have definitely become the protector in the relationship. Don't worry, she would absolutely agree with these sentiments. I mention this because, as we approached the restaurant, I saw the same guy from the day prior, leaning against the building, with his phone in his hand. I know that it was the same guy because he was also wearing the same thing. Still, a little weird, but whatever. He didn't look up at us this time. Hazel didn't seem to notice, and we continued inside. During dinner, Hazel mentioned a little shop she wanted to check out afterwards, and I agreed. It was across the street, so once we finished, we walked towards the intersection closer to us to cross. As we waited for the signal, I noticed the same guy was now walking slowly towards us. He didn't give off any weird vibes yesterday, and same for that moment. But it was still getting dark, and he was definitely bigger than us, so I was cautious, especially when he seemed to avoid eye contact. We all talked the day prior just fine, but maybe he just thought it was awkward and I was being paranoid. We crossed the street and went into the shop, but not before I noticed the guy crossing the street too. We spent some time in the store and chilled a bit, when I noticed the guy didn't come into the shop. After we made our purchase and left the building, I did a quick look around and noticed that the guy was now leaning against the building that we were just in. If he had no intention of speaking to us, why would you cross the street to do the exact same thing you were doing on a different building? And that's when I started getting suspicious. I had Hazel walk a little further ahead of me, and I tried to focus on Hazel talking to me, but also the sound of feet dragging behind us. After a few feet, I was growing impatient, so I gripped Hazel's hand and stopped. I turned around, and I saw this guy walking towards us, but he seemed to be dragging one leg. He wasn't bending his knee. "Can we help you?" I said to him with a slight annoyance in my voice. "I've got something in my pocket for you," he said in a creepy sing-song voice. It sent a chill down my spine, and the shakiness in Hazel's voice was all I needed to kick my fight or flight into gear. I basically told him, we're not interested, and we both picked up our pace. The whole time I could hear him behind us, making this little menacing giggle and repeating the same phrase over and over. He would even holler out for us to guess what it was, saying it was long, hard, and heavy. What kind of sick joke was he going for here? Not to mention the sheer audacity to do this in a public place. The good thing about Hazel and I is that we both could communicate well without speaking. A lot of strong couples can do that. So as we approached the intersection, I grabbed her hand again, we nodded at each other, and instead of pushing the button to cross, we unexpectedly ran through the crosswalk, hoping to throw the guy off. He shouted at us and tried to run across too. Our hotel was right across the street from where we were crossing, so we ran inside. We went to the desk, wanting to report the guy following us, but before we could explain it all, he walked through the doors, repeating what he had been saying. I practically screamed at him to leave us the F alone. Before he could get much further than the door, the guy at the main desk was walking towards him, telling him to leave. The guy waved at us and said that he'd be waiting for us, and then left the hotel. There was no way it was going to end there. I called the police from my phone. No, I wasn't thinking about calling them initially, but was rather focused on trying to get away. When they showed up, the officer talking to us told us the guy was still outside, so they had restrained him to question him. After explaining what all happened, they said they checked him for weapons, drugs, etc., like they normally do, but they found a large pipe in his pant leg. I don't know if I was relieved or more terrified. What even were his intentions? And why? He was fine with us the day prior. He was friendly and talkative, and now he's chasing us with a metal pipe? They said he was also under the influence, so they were taking him in. But they also said that they were quite familiar with the guy. Yet he was just out there, able to keep tormenting and terrorizing others. I was angry. They filed a report, and that was pretty much the end of it, saying nothing happened, so we were okay. No, we were not okay. We both sobered up pretty quickly in our rooms and thankfully slept fine, probably just worn out. I did my best to at least put the incident behind us so I could give Hazel a great birthday. We just Ubered everywhere that day. She seemed to have a great time and was very happy, so I guess I did pretty well. It was just unfortunate that one person could ruin a vacation, or a night, or even someone's life. I'm thankful that we were together and were able to run away, but it scares me to think that he may be out there today, traumatizing other women, and I just hope he was never successful at showing anyone that pipe. This started about 6 months ago. I was getting ready for bed in my room. It was maybe 10:30 p.m. My curtains were closed, so I couldn't see out the window, but I heard 3 hard knocks on the glass of my window. Of course, that scared the living crap out of me, so I didn't even look, and ran and got my dad, and made him look. Now, I live with my parents and 2 brothers in a fairly busy neighborhood, so noises weren't uncommon to hear. But this knock was directly on my window, so someone wanted me to hear it. The thing was, my bedroom isn't facing the front of the house, or the road, or anything. My room is actually towards the back of the house, so someone would have had to walk to the backyard in order to knock on my window, which seemed very odd. I had my dad check, but when he opened the curtains, no one was outside the window. He even went in the backyard to check. No one was there. That was the first incident. I closed my curtains and brushed it off as me hearing things or some sort of animal. The following night, at almost the exact same time, I heard another 3 knocks on my window. Immediately, I went and got my dad again, for him to just see nothing all over again. But this time I didn't brush it off, and I slept in my parents' room on the floor. The next few nights, there was nothing, until about a week later. I was home alone, and it was about 8:30 to 9 p.m., and I was on FaceTime with my friends, when I heard another 3 knocks on my window. This time I was home alone, so I couldn't go get my dad, but I ran into their room and called them. They told me to call the neighbor to check because they were out of town. So I did. The neighbor saw nothing. The night after, it was about 1 a.m. I think, I heard the knocking again. It wasn't 3 times though, it was more. It woke me up out of a dead sleep. I was tempted to just look out the window to see who, but part of me didn't want to know. I went and got my parents, who didn't bother to check at this point, because they didn't see anything the last few times. I kept hearing the knocking for the next few nights after, to the point where I ended up just sleeping on the couch. My parents decided to just let me move bedrooms, and so they moved my bedroom into what was the office, and switched everything around, so I hopefully wouldn't hear any more things. After moving bedrooms, I didn't hear anything. It was good for maybe 3 nights. Then I heard it again. The same knocking. 3 hard times. This time I looked out the window. I saw what I assume was a man, or a very big-built woman, crouching down, wearing a gray hoodie and some dark jeans. I can't recall the color. It was dark, so maybe gray or black. I closed the curtain and went and got my parents about it, and they informed the police. The police really couldn't do anything because we had no solid proof beside my words. They advised that we get a camera facing my bedroom and around that area of the house. So that's what we did. I haven't heard the knocking since, but I do wonder who it was. Nonetheless, it makes a good story to tell. In August of 1987, I was expecting my second child. My grandmother was in the hospital dying from internal bleeding from a fall that she had from falling out of her wheelchair. My mother had gone to visit my grandmother in the hospital. While they were talking, my grandmother said, "Get me off of this ship." My mother reminded my grandmother, her mother, that she was in the hospital. My grandmother insisted that she was on a ship. My mother asked her, "Who's on this ship with you?" Because my mom was a big believer in all things supernatural. She thought that she could get more information. My grandmother replied, "You know that guy who does the stories about the mob? Ned Day from the news? And my nurse. The one that comes during the night shift." My mom asked where the ship was going, and my grandmother said, "The cemetery." Obviously, my mom was a bit worried at that point, being a big believer. She knew the time was close for my grandma to pass away. The next day, I went to visit my grandmother in the hospital. I was 5 months pregnant and wasn't feeling that great. When I arrived, my grandma asked me to come close because she wanted to touch my belly. As she placed her hand on my belly, she told me, "It's a girl, you know." I said, "No, Grandma, I don't know. Because tomorrow they're going to do an ultrasound to see if they can see. And they'll tell me if it's a boy or a girl." My grandmother assured me that it was in fact a girl, and I told her that I would let her know once I found out. She said, "It's okay. I know it's a girl." I just smiled and said, "Okay, Grandma." Later that evening, my mother went to see Grandma, and my grandma told my mom, "Do you see her?" My mom asked her, "See who?" My grandmother said, "It's my mom. She's sitting in the corner, and she came to get me." My mom looked over, but she saw nobody, but asked her mother to describe the woman. My grandmother described her mother exactly and told my mom that she was waiting for her. After my mom left the hospital, she came home and was telling us all about what Grandma had said, and I told her what Grandma said to me about my baby. A few hours later, the hospital called my mom to say that Grandma had passed away. We were all devastated, but what's even stranger is that just a few days later, we heard that the newscaster, Ned Day, had also died. We were blown away. When my mom went back to the hospital to invite my grandmother's nurse to her funeral, my mother was informed that the nurse had tragically died in a car accident just that morning. Oh, and I got that ultrasound, and my baby was indeed a girl. So, that's it. I've been a true believer ever since. Grandma was right. Thanks for reading this, Raven. I love your podcast, and keep doing it. I will, and thank you for sending the story in. I encountered this on the 2nd of January, 2 days ago, when I was asleep in my room. I'm 18, female, and I live in Singapore with my parents. I'm sorry if this story is long, but I would appreciate it if you took your time to read and comment your thoughts. In my family, it's only myself, 18, female, my mom, 38, female, and my stepdad, 40, male, living in a small apartment. I have my own bedroom as I'm an only child. My parents took the smaller room and I had the master bedroom, which has a big window that is facing the back of our house. For my bedroom, there's a big space outside our window that's between every apartment unit here, so there's no way someone would unintentionally stand near my window. You have to walk in and go for a few turns before coming here. I eventually fell asleep around 11 p.m., and I forgot to close my blackout curtains from my window. Even though it's a frosted window, anyone can only see through it if they stood close to it for a closer look. At exactly 1:23 a.m., I checked the time when I woke up, I heard 3 loud knocks on my room window, which eventually woke me up as I'm a very light sleeper. At where I'm sleeping, my window is on the right corner and I can see whatever shadow that gets through it in the day or night. On that night, I didn't switch on any of my lights, so it was total darkness, except for my table lamp that was shined on me at the highest brightness. At first, I was sleeping while facing my room door, which is on my left, so I had an automatic response to turn my head and look at what was knocking on my window. To my surprise, I saw a silhouette of a man's head that was clearly visible in my window. I had goosebumps, and I froze because I was unsure of what to do, as the curtain was wide open, so obviously that man could see through my window. Despite my parents' room being right next to mine, I went into shock and had to call my mom. She was asleep, to help me check if I was tripping and to close my curtains for me. I told her what I saw afterwards. In the end, she advised me to sleep in the living room for the meantime to calm myself down. I felt really uneasy that night and I couldn't go back to sleep. Since I stayed awake that night, I heard 3 more knocks coming from my bedroom at 3 a.m., which, of course, I had to assume had come from the window. Before this happened, my curtains were already closed and blocking my window's view, so I thought that it would be fine for me to go ahead and get a look at who or what knocked on the window. The only difference this time is that the knock was louder, but slower, like the ones you would experience if you were in an old haunted house. Come to think about it, I wish that I had just stayed curious and stayed in my living room. I had my face and hand holding onto the window since I had to get closer and clearer look, since I didn't see a silhouette when I was standing from a distance from the window, and me still being paranoid from what happened hours before. I saw a man who was about 1.8 meters standing outside my room window, about 4 meters away, just standing and staring right at me, who was currently frozen in place at the window when I saw him. He was wearing long gray pants and a black t-shirt, and he had really, really pale skin. It looked as if he had no expression when he saw me. By the time that happened, I wasn't really sure if it was the same man that had stood outside at around 1:30 a.m. As much as I was tired that night, I knew that I was not hearing things or seeing hallucinations. I was perfectly wide awake when I saw that man. Moral of the story, always check your windows before falling asleep. And it's best to get blackout curtains to protect yourself. Of course, you could also guard your window with other protective measures. My mom has worked at a small rural hospital for about 6 years now. She's the ER receptionist, so she is the first person you see when you come into the emergency room, the one to give you all the paperwork to fill out and such. Throughout these 6 years, she worked mostly nights, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and has seen quite the cast of characters the town has to offer. Every transient, druggie, and local has passed through that lobby, and she has seen each one at least twice. But one night, she encountered something she had never seen before or again since. Back in the first year, my mom was quick to get the hang of things, so she was left alone to work the counter. The ER faced the parking lot so she could see people coming in from far away and anticipate their moves. One night, at about 2 a.m., she was working on her computer, looked up, and was surprised to see 2 people standing there. A man and a woman just standing there, staring at her. And she stared back. The parking lot was dark, no car in sight, and they just appeared. After a long moment, they came into the lobby and went right up to the desk. My mom said the alarm bells started going off in her head that something wasn't right. For one thing, they were very tall. The desk my mom sat at would come up to mid-chest on an average person. With these people, my mom could see the pelvic bone of the woman. They were dressed for hot weather because it was summer. They were also very skinny and, my mom emphasized this, very dry looking. But they didn't look like your typical druggies. The woman kept stroking her neck with long fingers, saying she had a sore throat. My mom, for the first and only time, didn't say a word. She just looked at them. A word kept repeating in her head. Strigway. As my mom looked at them, the woman looked to the man, looked back at my mom, and then to the man again. The whole time just smiling and stroking her throat, and said to the man, "Do you think she'll let us through? Or should we go somewhere else?" My mom stayed silent as the woman repeated the pattern of looks, and then they both smiled at my mom and left. Almost after, my mom texted me, asking if vampires needed permission to enter places like hospitals. I told her since she was technically the person to say who went back to the ER, they would need her permission. We both knew that Strigway was a type of Romanian vampire mythos, and that was the word she kept hearing in her mind. She has never seen that couple again, and we still talk about what happened. It does make me wonder when I hear about stories of black-eyed children and other tales of vampires. What did she see that night? And how close was she to something unreal? I used to sneak out at ages 15 through 17. I don't anymore as I have my own life going on as I am an adult now. It was about 2:30, almost 3 o'clock at night. I was going to a friend's house as they were going to sneak me in, chill, and have a smoke session. While I was walking to their house, it was already creepy as it was. The night was still and the sounds creeping around made everything eerier. I made it to their house without any issues. We lit a few cigarettes and did as I said before. I do not condone smoking or doing anything in this story to anyone under the age of 18. When it started to get late, I went back to my house. It was about a 15-minute walk at most. Everything stayed the same until I was going down a hill. There was a lot of houses where I lived, but it wasn't a good neighborhood, to be honest. I have a lot of stories about it that I'll possibly share in the future. I got stopped by this tall guy. I'm a woman, about 5'5", and very skinny with little to no muscle, so anyone could just beat me and do other horrible things to me. He was a drug addict, as he looked very ill and had some red spots on his skin. He asked if I had a lighter, and I did, but I lied and said no. He nodded, and then made small talk as I contributed back to the small talk, backing away slowly and eventually leaving. I felt very odd. I felt as if I was being watched or followed. A very uneasy feeling. I turned back and saw the same guy. He asked again if I had a lighter. Again, a bit annoyed and scared, I said no. I knew it showed in my voice, but I started to speed walk to my house, as I had to go up another hill and down a hill to reach my house. I still had that feeling lurking in my stomach, and my mind started to race. I turned back and saw the same damn guy, asking the same question. I looked around and found a group of guys who I thankfully knew. I said no and then darted across the street to greet them, telling them what happened, and one of them walked me back to my house. If it wasn't for knowing a lot of people at my age, I probably would have been attacked. I'm thankful every time and get goosebumps by thinking about it. For those who think it's fun to sneak out, please don't. It's not worth your life or to add trauma in any way. Stay safe out there. And Raven, thank you for sharing my story. I told my GP that I had an odd experience while coming out of anesthesia. He asked if I met God. Well, no, not God. But let me start at the beginning. Apparently the first thing I said after the surgery was that if anything went wrong, my return address is on my back. I don't remember that, but in point of fact, my return address is on my back. It says, property of the William M. Bass Donated Skeletal Collection. My own memories are a bit scrambled. I knew where I was, I could hear the sounds of the recovery area, but that's not what I was seeing. I was wandering among gigantic carved stone monoliths of deities from various religions, ages, and locales. They were aware of me, but mostly I was beneath their notice. To complicate matters, I was not wearing my glasses. Now, I'm not blind. Yet. Again. I will undoubtedly reach -8 diopters again, eventually. But in this instance, my brain decided that I never had eye surgery, and that my vision was still around -12. Maybe worse. I had to get really close to the statues to make out details clear enough to recognize who was who before I moved on. Which is why I was within arm's reach before I realized what I was seeing on one. It was a skirt of rattlesnakes, and a necklace of hearts and severed human hands. Mind you, I respect Kotliku, but it occurred to me that the Aztec goddess of the womb in the tomb might not be a felicitous entity to encounter while recovering from heart surgery. I was trying to apologize respectfully while backing away when I finally woke up.